Hello everyone, and welcome to this talk on the Kubernetes Insider. My name is James Spurin, and just a quick heads up before we start. In case you're not actually aware, in 5 minutes or less, there's going to be a national emergency phone test. If you don't mind, if you're able to turn your phones off, that would be great. I think if your phone's on silent or do not disturb, it still may actually ring. So yeah, anything that can actually be done there, super appreciated. So the Kubernetes Insider is a Docker desktop extension that elevates Kubernetes productivity. So if you're already using Kubernetes with Docker desktop or you're looking to get started, this will help you out tremendously. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's James Spurin. I'm a Docker captain and a CNCF ambassador, and I specialize in creating professional courses that cover Docker, Kubernetes, DevOps, and Cloud Native. And when I create courses, I typically like to have those courses with immersive lab environments. So if that's of any interest, have a look and do connect with me afterwards. So the Kubernetes Insider Docker Desktop extension. In this talk, we're going to go over an overview of the extension with a demo. You've actually got the source code and the installation there. There's a QR code. I know I did just tell you to turn your phones off, but nice and easy. You can go to github.com/my surname Spurin/Kubernetes-Insider, and it's literally a one-liner. You just copy and paste that into your terminal, and it will actually install. And after this talk, I'm going to be putting this onto the Docker Desktop Marketplace, so then you can just go into the Marketplace and you can click Install. After we've actually gone through the overview and we've seen the Kubernetes Insider in action, I'm going to take you behind the scenes on how this was actually made, some tips and tricks and approaches you can actually use for A, creating your own extensions, and B, shortcutting it so that Kubernetes will just work for you. So some of the challenges, why this extension came about. Where I teach Kubernetes, I often find that especially a lot of newcomers to Kubernetes, they struggle initially with various aspects. So the first one, the Kubernetes infrastructure, there we go. The Kubernetes infrastructure and pod networking. So for example, when you install Kubernetes in Docker Desktop, it's hidden in a virtual machine. There's some abstraction that actually goes on between it. And sometimes new users of Kubernetes, they'll follow a tutorial, they'll run a pod, they'll see that pod IP address, but then they can't actually access it. And usually the means of how to actually access this and make use of it is another layer that they actually have to learn, which is challenging when you just really want to get into this. Other aspects, so to access your pods, deployments, you need to have knowledge of Kubernetes services, so cluster IP, node port, load balancers. And again, techniques like using kubectl port forward to access your web services are typically taught later on in the curriculum. So let's actually dive into this and take a look at the Kubernetes Insider and how this actually makes this easier for you. So you can actually see there on the left-hand side, we've got two ones there. We've got the Kubernetes Insider, and that's actually my other talk. So I've got another talk later on with some cool matrix stuff. So if you're free and you like this, come along to that later. But if we take a look at the Kubernetes Insider, with this installed, you get this menu and you get an example that you can run straight away in your Docker Desktop Kubernetes. So I'm just going to click copy on this, And if I go to my terminal and I actually paste this, it's creating a pod, Flappy Dock, and that condition is met. And now we can quite simply, that was in the default namespace, it was a pod, it was Flappy Dock, it's running on port 80, and there we go. We've actually got the Flappy Dock game. We haven't done any messing around here with services or port forwarding. It's literally good to go, and I'm going to take this opportunity to set a national record live on Flappy Dock. I mean, this is immense pressure. Okay, that's embarrassing. I will go down in history with a 4 on Flappy Dock. Try the extension out. Try that that example which is on there. See if you can actually do better on Flappy Dock than I just did. I'm normally averaging around 20 or so, but yeah, I think it was the pressure of the live talk. But yes, this is a great, albeit a simple, but a great example of how you can access pods in Kubernetes. So let's actually take that a little bit further. I'll just bring down this window so you can actually see this over the top of this. And what I'm actually going to do here is show the dynamic features of this. So I'm just going to leave that drop down there, and we'll run something else in Kubernetes. So kubectl run. I have some images here which are just Nginx with a customized background. So just a red background. So Nginx-red. And if you watch the top, you'll actually see that they dynamically appear as you actually do this. And there we go. We've got a red and a blue. So if I actually select this and I run this, you can actually see we've got a blue background and we've got a red background. So those were simple pods, but we can also do other things. So for example, if I create a deployment, so we'll create a deployment nginx/debug / image equals Spurin nginx-debug. Oh, and we'll put some replicas. Replicas equals free. And straight away you can actually see there the deployment option has popped up. And if I actually choose nginx debug, you can see we've got this debug interface there with nginx. And if I press go, you'll actually notice the request ID is cycling. Something else you can actually do with this, sometimes when you run things in Kubernetes, you have to actually access them under a particular path. So for example, one of my colleagues in the Docker side, he makes use of traffic, and for traffic you actually need to give the path of /dashboard. So you can actually do that and put anything on, and you can do that multipath. And essentially, whilst this is a deployment, you can actually go back, and if you really wanted to, you could access the individual pods of that deployment. So if I go back to pod here, now where we ran 3 replicas, you can actually see nginx debug with each of the replicas that we have there. So I'll pick that KN one and I'll press go, and you can see that was serviced by that. And we'll do this PHP one as well. PHP CV sounds like a product, doesn't it? So that's pods and deployments. And as well, once you actually, if you get into the realms of services with Kubernetes, or if you've run something that makes use of a service, so let's make a quick service. We'll expose this deployment nginx-debug, and we'll do it just to show something different. We'll do it on a different port, target port. So our front-end port will be 8080, and our target port, target dash port equals 80. And there we've got that service now. We can see Nginx debug. I'll change that to 8080. I'll put that as test service. And there we go. That's working as expected. So anything that you actually make use of in that Docker desktop environment, so for example, if you were interested in something like AWX with Ansible and you install it, you don't need to actually mess around with any port forwarding. You can just choose this in the menu and easily access it. So that's the summary of the extension, and we now get on to the realms of how I built this. And you might be surprised to learn with this that prior to creating this extension, I had zero experience with creating anything in React or creating anything in TypeScript. I had an idea of how I wanted this extension to look. So essentially that top bar that you actually saw, the input menus and the various selectors, when somebody presses go, it should open a frame in the bottom. But yes, I didn't have any experience, so probably like most people who are here now or online, I turned to my new peer programming buddy, ChatGPT, and you can actually see I've got the original prompt there that started all of this. I went back through my history, create a React web app that uses material design. There should be a horizontal form on the top bar with the following and various information there and a go button. And when it's pressed, it should call a function, a dummy function, and then it will load an iframe. And I went back through a number of times with this, and I even had to ask it questions with, hey, you've given me your list, how do I actually run it now? I was completely novice on all of this. But eventually, I had this application which was there, the framework was in place, and I manually set up a kubectl port forward. So that's all this extension is actually doing. When you run something, transparently in the background, it's setting a port forward in, and then it's opening in that frame. And I did the port forward in, I pressed the go button, I was excited, and it didn't work. And why didn't it work? Cause cross-origin resource sharing. And if you're doing a lot of development, I've no doubt that you would have come across cause before. It's essentially a security feature implemented in the browser that controls how web pages in one domain can make requests to another domain. So what you actually have here with this application, the main bit that you actually see would be one domain. So it, for example, would be listening on a certain port, and then the port forwarding would be on another domain. And cause will actually stop you cross-accessing on that. And it gets a little bit more complicated than that again. When you run an application in the Docker Desktop extension framework, the origin is a file origin. So the equivalent, if you dragged and dropped a HTML file into your browser, and you'll see it will load with file : // that's essentially what Docker Desktop is doing behind the scenes with Electron. So we had these two different origins, and it was a problem. And normally if you want to address and fix cause, you're supposed to change your application so that it says, hey, I'm okay with being used in this way, which we don't want to do. We want to be able to run anything in Kubernetes as we please. So how did we get around this? The workaround was making use of Nginx once again, so I absolutely love Nginx. My buddy there in the front row works for Nginx, so yeah, big shout out there and happy on this. But essentially, what we actually do is we use Nginx as a middleware to essentially update responses. So what actually happens, Docker Desktop will make a request to Nginx. Nginx will make the request to the Kubernetes web target. The Kubernetes target responds, and then as it responds, Nginx is injecting some cause headers into it, saying, I allow everything with cause, and then it passes it back to the Docker Desktop extension. So as far as the Docker Desktop extension is concerned, it's got everything it needs to satisfy cause. So this actually allows you to run anything Kubernetes based in Docker Desktop extension, and cause will be satisfied. On to the next bit, so building the extension itself. I had this code as an example. It was just running in my browser at the time as a standard React app. How do we actually then take that application and make it into a Docker Desktop extension? And if you're interested in making your own extensions, when you go into the SDK documentation, there's two main areas. There's create a simple extension and create an advanced front-end extension. And don't actually be put off in any way by the create an advanced. That is the best example to take it. It gives you a lot of boilerplate, a lot of real-life examples that you can actually use. So all I did in this case was I followed the tutorial which was on that page. I created a dummy extension, and I took my ChatGPT assisted code and I literally dropped it into the extension framework, which it had actually built up. And after a few restarts, I had my extension running in Docker Desktop. So the next challenge then was, how do we actually get this working with Kubernetes? How do we access Kubernetes from within an extension? And fortunately, the team at Loft have done a lot of efforts on this, which you can make use of and reuse. So Loft released an extension called vCluster, and in vCluster they handle a lot of the interaction. So for example, when you click the extension in Docker Desktop, one of the first things it does is it checks if the Kubernetes server that's built into Docker Desktop is running. If it is running, it will load your page. If it's not running, it will give you a warning at the top. So they did all of that, and they also have, as part of their code base, they capture the Kubernetes kubeconfig file, which if you want to actually do anything with Kubernetes, you need that file. So essentially, I reused those efforts to quickly create this, and I've done a blog on another topic. This was an extension for K9S, but I reuse that code so much. And if you're going to be creating any extensions that interact with Kubernetes, you can just see that blog there, which is on the official docker.com site, and that will fast track a lot of it for you. So that was literally copying some blocks of code into my React code. And what else did we actually need for this? So I mentioned that we have Nginx, which is handling cause for us. That's actually working as a middle proxy. And we also needed some kind of API. So needed to be able to make an API request, to set up the port forwarding. I've done quite a lot in Python myself. I'm well experienced there, but again, I still used ChatGPT to fast track this, and this created the API which would actually set up that Kubernetes port forwarding that we see in the background. So we have all of these different components now. We've got a front end, we've got Nginx, and we've got the API. How do we run all of these in an extension? Well, the great thing is that Docker Compose is an integral part of Docker Desktop extensions. If you have done something with Docker Compose already, you can convert this to an extension extremely quickly. So what we're going to do is go back to the terminal, and I'm going to show you there's essentially 3 files in any extension. So whether it's my own extension, your extension, or even someone else's extension, if you want to know how that extension works, if you look at these 3 files, you'll have a really good understanding of how that actually ticks behind the scene. So if we just go back, and I'm actually in the code directory for this. So the first file, which I bring your attention to, is called metadata.json. And let me just resize that. Yeah, and as you can actually see there, we've got a reference to the icon. So that was the actual icon that you see on the sidebar there. We have a UI section. So the UI is essentially the React code for this. So /UI, and it's reading that index.html. Then we have this VM section. So the VM section actually, it handles 2 different areas. Number 1, it's where you actually reference your Docker Compose file. And number 2, you have the ability to create sockets where you can actually communicate between your user interface and your back end. And the loft code that communicates with Kubernetes and sets that all up for you, that makes use of a socket. So I essentially reused that. That's part of the code that I took over. And then within this, you have a host section. And the host section is, if, for example, you wanted to have specific binaries that are executed as part of that Docker Desktop extension, this is where you'd actually make use to them. And as you can actually see, this is kubectl. So what actually happens, your extension is actually loaded. It checks that Kubernetes is running. If it is running, it does a kubectl get config. So it captures that config. Then it sends it via that socket, which from the loft code reuse, we just write it to a shared volume. And once it's on that shared volume, any of our services can essentially use that for communicating with Kubernetes. So this is file 1. Whenever you're checking somebody's extension, have a look at this. This gives you your quick 10,000 foot view. The next one to look at is the one which was referenced there, the Docker Compose. So you can actually see this. Again, this is reusing the efforts of Loft and vCluster. This is where we have the capture kube config. So it's going to capture that and pass through the socket. And for the API, I actually bundled this. I mentioned that we needed Nginx, we needed an API. I just run them both as one container. So this is just a container image for Nginx that hosts the API, and you can actually see there it's got some ports referenced where it bypasses cores. Oh, and also there you can see the shared volume. So we have this kubeconfig volume. It's used here. It's used in the capture kubeconfig. This does the work of actually capturing it, and then the API is able to read it from that volume. And the last file in the extension is quite simply a Docker file that holds all of the extension together. Again, reuse of the loft efforts. This first bit at the top is essentially the code they set up for the capture. We've got the UI builder, which was taken from that SDK extension I told you about. We copy the UI source to /UI, and most of this is just generic, what you actually got. If you ever are publishing an extension to the marketplace, you would want to be concerned with this. This is where you set up any screenshots, for example, that people will actually see in the marketplace. So after DockerCon finishes and I release this, if you check back in that file, you will see that that makes reference to some screenshots. And lastly, we have the code here that sets up the kubectl binaries, so one for each platform, one for Mac OS, Windows, and Linux. And yeah, that puts that extension together, and once you've actually got that, you can install the extension and you're good to go. And the backstory on this extension, originally I went to the Docker team, I told them about this idea for this, and that I thought this could help out, especially people who are new to Kubernetes. It's a great way of helping them get started with Kubernetes, or if you're actually using Docker Desktop to build Kubernetes applications, it saves you on the productivity with not having to mess around with specialized services or port forwarding. And my ultimate goal with this project is for it to actually not be an extension in the future, but for it to be native functionality of Docker Desktop. So if you find this useful and you're actually using it, please do feedback to Docker, and hopefully in the future I can retire this and I will be happy closing the GitHub project. So that's it. I hope you liked it, and we can go to questions. Hey, hello. So sorry, just come a little bit forward. So you say that again. So.
Yeah, I'm curious more about not just viewing the web pages and running into it, but actual display.
Okay, yeah. So that's really interesting. So the Kubernetes Insider, it is targeted specifically at web applications. But what I did there's another extension which is it is actually on the marketplace. If you search for K9S, you'll see that I have a K9S one there. And the way I actually bridged what you're saying is how would you run something. I used, there's an open source project called TTYD, which allows you to run a terminal as a web page. So it's used everywhere. If you ever use anything like iDRAC or some kind of terminal access in a web, behind the scenes, a lot of the time people are using this TTYD project, which is in itself it's using xterm.js. But in short, if the way I did the K9S one, I ran TTYD in the container, and that creates a web terminal page. I can show you actually I'll give you a sneak preview of my talk for later, but you can actually see this is my talk for later, and this is essentially doing exactly the same thing. It's using, possibly you can, there you can go. You can see it's running TTYD with bin bash, and the K9S one is doing exactly the same. It's just TTYD K9S, and then you redirect people to the web interface. So yeah, I love that. That TTYD project is really good. It's definitely worth a look. So yes, and come to that one later on. So what we're going to do is, from scratch, we're going to take the C matrix source code, and we're going to build matrix terminals and have them running. Matrix screensavers, essentially. Yeah, great question, thank you. And anybody else? Sorry, you might have to, I can't quite hear you there. Coming down. So this, all we're actually doing here is running the, you can see where my mouse is on the bottom. We're running the built-in Kubernetes server in Docker Desktop. So if you just go in, yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, so if you go into the resources here and into Kubernetes, it's not enabled by default, but you just go into this, you click the enable, and your bar will actually change at the bottom there. So you will have Docker and Kubernetes, and then the Kubernetes Insider is working specifically with that built-in Kubernetes cluster, and it's great. It's single node, but from a learning viewpoint, you can do a tremendous amount of stuff. You can do 60% of stuff before you then have to go to something multi-node. Yep, you could. Essentially, if you were to dig into the Kubernetes server behind the scenes, it's a kubeadm built single node. So kubeadm is the reference standard for Kubernetes, and it's built using that. And I think that if you actually search for Docker Desktop Kubernetes, there is a docker.com blog which tells you how it's all built and what they actually did behind the scenes. But it's brilliant. You can certainly you can use it for a lot of things. You can get quite far through on a lot of the certification studies as well with that instance. All right. Okay, was there any more? Oh yeah, oh yeah. So what actually happens with the extension in particular right now, it is specifically targeting the built-in Kubernetes cluster. So what it actually does, when it makes that host call out using the kubectl binary, it is specifically only grabbing the context of the built-in Kubernetes, the built-in Kubernetes server. So from the extension viewpoint, all you're actually accessing is the web front end. But if you're actually looking at this from the viewpoint of Kubernetes, and let's just say you were actually using this directly there, it is a single node Kubernetes cluster. You're able to access everything locally from there. Maybe I'm missing the question. Yes, yeah. No, it doesn't. It's yes, it's specific to this. So if I actually bring up kube config, so this is the default cluster, and if for example my kube config file had multiple clusters in there, the code which is actually lifted from Loft, when you, I can show this here, you'll see. If I actually click off and I click back on, you'll notice the spinner at the top. So that's the check. That's the code lifted from Loft. And what that is actually doing at that point, the UI is making a request to that kubectl binary, and it's doing, essentially it's doing a kubectl get config, and specifically it's saying give me the context of Docker desktop. And then if for example your kube config file had 20 clusters in there, it's going to grab that one and then it sends it over the socket to the internals of the extension. So the internals of the extension, it only ever receives the context for Docker desktop. So it can only ever interact with that. But if you were actually looking at this from a viewpoint of building extensions, this is a design decision in this. You could actually, however, do something where you are making extensions that communicate with other clusters. Things like vCluster and other extensions allow you to actually do that, to interact with different clusters, not just the default one. Yeah, great question, thanks. Hey. Yeah, so what if we go back, you've actually got this, remember the 30,000, well, the 10,000 foot view, you have this host section. So this is a specific section where you can actually make reference to paths that the UI can actually interact with. And what actually happens in the main Docker file is you can see it's actually just grabbing them there. It's going to the Kubernetes releases. It's looking at the current. It's doing a curl to work out the version of the latest stable version, and it's pulling that kubectl binary into the actual extension, so that the free versions of kubectl will exist in that Docker desktop extension, and then the UI, as part of the extension framework, there's some specific JavaScript code that you can actually call to interact with things which are declared using that host variable. So you then, if you look through the SDK guide, you'll see them as dd client dot calls, and Yeah, so to answer your question, you can actually see that here. It pulls down one for each, and then it's put in one in Linux, one in Darwin, and one in Windows. And the framework actually then handles that accordingly. It knows if you're running the extension on Mac OS or Windows or Linux, and it knows where to actually then look for the correct binary. Well, essentially it uses this as a lookup table, so you can see if it's looking up that, it's finding it there. If it's looking up this, it's finding it there. Yeah, great, thank you. Hey, I like this, lots of questions. I'm not too sure on what happens behind the scenes, but if you look through that SDK documentation and you look in the hosts, there's a particular part of the SDK documentation which details those aspects that I mentioned. So remember when we were going through the metadata.json. So breaking it down, you've got UI, you've got VM, and you've got host. If you look through the documentation, there's a particular breakdown which goes into detail how that host bit works. And it gives you examples to say, if you actually do this, you can then call this with DD client. And it's how it works, I don't know, but I do know that the Docker team have built all of that framework for you. So all you do, if you're building an extension, for example, you could put it into debug mode, where you'll have like a Chrome console, and you can actually just type them out. You can just do dd client.exec and do that as your initial process for building. Yeah, exactly. So the UI is just a web page application. Whilst this one is React, I've created other extensions where it's literally just a boilerplate index.html file. So that's your UI. You then have as part of the load-in, it will import some JavaScript libraries, and if your code actually does that, you can make those specific calls to the framework, and then you can do other things like call in specific binaries, etc. Nice. Okay, any more questions? All right, I think we're good. Thank you very much, everyone.